Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. Before we get started today, I would like to reiterate the comments yesterday from the President and the Attorney General condemning the horrific acts of terrorism in Brussels. As the Attorney General said, we've been in contact with our counterparts in Belgium, offering any and all assistance to them. I'm not going to have any operational updates for you on that today, but our thoughts and prayers continue to be with the people of Belgium and their victims and their families. But thankfully, we are here today with some good news. I am pleased to be joined today by David Harlow, who is the Deputy Director of the United States Marshals Service, Deputy Commander Ed McMahon, as well as Commander Frank Sciamento. We also have today with us the Baltimore Police Commissioner Kevin Davis, and we are here to announce the results of a 6-week violent fugitive sweep across the country. Now, this major initiative, which is known as Operation Violence Reduction12, or VR12, was conducted by the Marshals Service together with our state, local, tribal law enforcement counterparts. It was designed to help our local communities combat the problem of violent crime by getting the most dangerous criminals off their streets. Through VR12, over 8,000 violent fugitives who were preying on our communities were tracked down and arrested. Now, let me say right at the front, this was not a dragnet type operation that was designed to arrest anybody out there with an outstanding warrant. It was focused and it was targeted. And that's because we really know that the majority of violence in communities is committed by a relatively small handful of bad actors. I saw this firsthand during my time when I was United States Attorney in an AUSA in Atlanta for over 27 years. We've learned that if you can identify that relatively small handful of bad actors, and if you can rid the community of them, you can really transform neighborhoods. And that's what the Marshals Service and our state and local partners did with VR12. First, they started by focusing on cities that had a higher than average level of violent crime. They then talked with folks here at the department with our Violence Reduction Network and our Violent Crime Working Group, and also had discussions with U.S. attorneys here to identify the cities where we should focus our efforts. And they narrowed it down to 12 cities. Those 12 cities being Baltimore, Brooklyn, Camden, Chicago, Compton, Fresno, Gary, Milwaukee, New Orleans, Oakland, Savannah, and Washington, D.C. The Marshals then took all of the open state and local arrest warrants in those cities, that being, fugitives that have outstanding warrants that haven't yet been arrested, and they went through each one of those. Rather than just taking the first warrants off the top or picking the ones that would be easiest to apprehend, they went through all of those warrants looking for the most dangerous and violent fugitives. And they used uniform criteria to identify these. They focused on defendants who were wanted for murder and aggravated assault and child molestation and arson and kidnapping. And then, even beyond that, they then prioritized those defendants, those fugitives, who had multiple prior arrest and convictions, those repeat offenders. This took a whole lot of planning, and this was not an easy task. But by planning carefully, they were able to target our efforts here to ensure that we were focusing our efforts on those who are really responsible for most of the violence in the communities. And so, with warrants in hand and after a whole lot of extra training to address the particularly dangerous situations that they would encounter here, the marshals and our state and local partners got to work, arresting the worst of the worst. Specifically from February 1st to March 11th, for 6 weeks, they tracked down and arrested 8,075 violent fugitives from justice. These more than 8,000 fugitives included 559 fugitives who were wanted for homicides, 648 gang members, and 846 sex offenders. Now, those figures bear repeating. That's 559 people wanted for murder, wanted for killing people, 648 gang members, and nearly 1,000 sex offenders that were taken off the streets as a result of this initiative. Beyond that, each one of the individuals who was arrested in VR12 had an average of 7 prior arrests and 3 prior convictions for violent offenses. To give you a sense of this operation, I'd like to give you a couple of examples of the violent fugitives who are no longer victimizing our communities. The first is David Lee Skelly. Skelly was wanted in Toledo, Ohio on charges of repeatedly raping a young child. He had been profiled several times on America's Most Wanted and had been a fugitive for over 15 years. He'd previously been arrested for rape and assault and robbery. But on February 26th of this year, Skelly, who was living under an alias at the time, was arrested in Colorado by members of the Colorado Violent Offenders Task Force. A second fugitive arrested in VR12, Michael Sykes, was wanted in New York City for brutally stabbing to death his girlfriend, his own 5-month-old daughter, his girlfriend's 1-year-old daughter, and he also attacked his girlfriend's 2-year-old little girl. She was the only one to survive his attacks and fittingly is named Miracle. Sykes had previously been arrested on assault and weapons charges, but on February 13th of this year, he was arrested in Queens, New York, by members of the Marshals Service New York, New Jersey Regional Fugitive Task Force. In addition to arresting violent fugitives who were still out prowling on our streets, the Marshals Service and our state and local counterparts rescued 17 children who had been abducted from their parents or guardians. These children ranged in ages from 11 months to 15 years old. I'll give you just one example there. Juan Perez Cueva was wanted by the government of Mexico for the November 2008 murder of his wife and the abduction of his 2 young daughters. After he was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison in Mexico, he kidnapped his 2 young daughters and fled to the United States. He had been living here all that time. He was located and arrested on February 9th of 2016 in Glendora, California, by members of the Marshals Service Pacific Southwest Regional Fugitive Task Force. And I'm happy to report the girls were safely returned to their grandparents. Operation VR12 is really an important example of the type of work that the United States Marshals Service and our state, local, and tribal law enforcement partners do every single day. And it highlights the importance of our working together to do everything we can to make our communities as safe as possible. But as you would expect, going after the worst of the worst is dangerous business. Just last year, in March of last year, Deputy U.S. Marshal Josie Wells was killed in the line of duty when he was executing an arrest warrant for a defendant who was wanted for a double homicide. So we honor Josie and his memory by continuing to try to protect his community in service of the country and the communities that he loved so much. I'm gratified and relieved to report to you that this year, no Deputy U.S. Marshal or any of our state and local counterparts were killed or seriously injured in the line of duty. But they did encounter some particularly challenging and dangerous situations. Fugitives forced gun battles. They forced barricaded standoffs. They assaulted the officers, and they did pretty much everything that they could to evade arrest. But because of the smart, targeted, and well-planned efforts of the Marshals Service and our law enforcement partners, communities all over the country are safer today. And now I would like to turn things over to Deputy Director Harlow for him to tell you a little bit more about this operation.
Thank you, Deputy Attorney General Yates, and thank you all for being here this morning. In particular, on behalf of the men and the women of the Marshals Service, I want to thank Deputy Attorney General Yates for her tireless support of the Marshals Service and the fact that we all know that she recognizes the vitality of the work that the Deputy Marshals do every day and the dangerousness of the job that they do. The United States Marshals Service was honored to be entrusted with this critical task of addressing violent crime in this nation. As an agency that has apprehended over 1 million violent felony fugitives in the past decade, the Marshals Service understands that every arrest makes our communities safer. With Violence Reduction 12, we were able to go a step further and demonstrate that by narrowly focusing our criteria to take the most violent offenders off the street, we can have an even greater impact on violent crime. As a nationwide initiative with participation from all 94 of our districts, VR12 was felt in communities of all sizes, well beyond the 12 targeted cities. Over the past 6 weeks, Deputy U.S. Marshals and Task Force officers have focused their investigative efforts on violent felony fugitives, meeting the operation's established criteria with increased focus on gang members and sex offenders. Our strategic and focused approach to locate and apprehend the worst of the worst criminals produced tremendous results. the Marshals Service, with help from federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement partners, arrested 8,075 fugitives over that 6-week period. It's important to note that there were another 5,500 fugitives who were arrested during that same time period that did not meet that strict criteria. As mentioned by the Deputy Attorney General, the average fugitive was 35 years old, had 7 prior arrests and 3 prior convictions. This truly validates that we're going after the most dangerous criminals with their hardened experience and their repeat offenders. Among the experienced criminals apprehended in VR12 is a couple many of you are familiar with: Blake Fitzgerald and Brittany Harper, dubbed by the media as the modern-day Bonnie and Clyde. This couple was wanted in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Missouri for multiple counts of armed robbery, burglary, kidnapping, and firearms charges. They had criminal histories of assault, burglary, robbery, weapons charges, and narcotics offenses. On February 5th, 2016, following their commission of a series of violent crimes, in their attempt to evade capture by members of our Florida Violent Fugitive Regional Fugitive Task Force, Fitzgerald and Harper initiated exchange of gunfire with local police in Milton, Florida. Fitzgerald was killed and Harper was arrested and taken into custody. Task Force members safely evacuated 2 elderly residents from a home just minutes before the shooting began. There were thousands of other dangerous fugitives like Fitzgerald and Harper apprehended during this operation. They may not all be as well known, but the 9,600 federal, state, and local fugitive warrants that were clear with the rest of these dangerous criminals, we can see we truly got the worst of the worst off the streets. In addition to the 559 fugitives wanted for homicide, the 946 fugitives wanted for sex offenses, and the 648 gang members, Operation VR12 also netted over 70 kilograms of narcotics, nearly $400,000 in cash, and 463 firearms out of the possession of felons. As I mentioned, successfully focusing on arresting the most violent criminals was the primary goal of this operation, but there were 2 byproducts of the operation. First, as the DAG mentioned, the operation led to the recovery of 17 missing, endangered, or abducted children and the rescue of 1 kidnapped adult, as well as the apprehension of 11 of the victims' abductors. Secondly, the Marshals Service provided valuable assistance to our state and local partners by arresting 675 additional people who were not targets of this investigation. We merely happened upon them in the course of what we were doing. Of those 675 fugitives, 277 of them met the VR12 criteria. 16 of them were wanted for homicide. 30 of them were wanted outside the state they were apprehended in. This is the Marshals Service is in a unique position to assist state, local, and tribal enforcement. And our agency is appreciative of the tremendous amount of support that we receive from these partners every day and we receive during this operation. We're regularly supported by approximately 2,000 Special Deputy United States Marshals in our 67 task forces across districts in our regions in the U.S. During Operation VR12, the Marshals Service also teamed up with our tribal law enforcement partners. As an example, in Oklahoma, the Marshals Service deputized members of the Cherokee Nation Marshals. Within only a 3-day period, this team arrested over 60 violent felons. Our powerful network of law enforcement officers serves as a force multiplier, enabling the Marshals Service to broaden its reach. The impact of that reach is clear not only in the VR12 results, but in the hard work we do every day. In the past decade, the U.S. Marshals Service has arrested more than 35,000 fugitives wanted for homicide, more than 38,000 gang members, and more than 125,000 sex offenders. We've also seized more than 24,000 firearms, recovered hundreds of missing and exploited children, completed over 300,000 compliance checks of sex offenders, and managed over $1 billion in seized assets. I would like to thank all the Deputy United States Marshals and Task Force officers across the nation who contributed to the success of this operation. I would also like to thank all law enforcement officers who are on the job and thank them for the job they do every day. I recognize the dangers they face, the time they spend away from their families, and the other sacrifices they make in order to make our communities safer. The safety of our communities has always been the driving force behind the work we do, and we are proud that 8,075 violent fugitives are taken off the street. But we're even more gratified to know that for each one of those apprehensions, there are countless lives in numerous communities that are affected. We realize that for every arrest we make, there's a story of a victim who's finally receiving justice, and a neighborhood where citizens are less afraid for their safety. To share the impact of this operation on his city, I would like to now introduce one of our local law enforcement partners. Baltimore Police Commissioner Kevin Davis brings a wealth of law enforcement experience in the state of Maryland, including the Anne Arundel County and the Prince George's County Police. I would like to invite Commissioner Davis to discuss Operation VR12 and the impact on his city.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Deputy Attorney General Yates. It's good to be back in our nation's capital, and it's good to see some familiar faces I haven't seen in a while. I'm really thankful for this multi-jurisdictional partnership, and it is a true partnership, and partnerships take work. But we have one common goal, and that's to get these bad guys off of our streets. During the course of Operation VR12, 148 fugitives were arrested in Baltimore, clearing a total of 160 arrest warrants. 23 were wanted for murder. Today I want to highlight one of those cases that originated out of Baltimore, and thanks to Operation VR12 and members of the Capital Area Regional Fugitive Task Force, we were able to take this person into custody after he fled Baltimore and after he fled Maryland. This case involved two vulnerable victims, and I think the news of it reached Washington and beyond. It occurred on February 26, 2016 in the early afternoon. Two elderly siblings, and they would do this routinely. They'd go to a parking lot, they'd park their car, and they'd go across the street to get a sandwich, about once a week or so. Lifelong folks from Baltimore. As they were crossing the street of this busy shopping center where they parked their car, they were both shot. This was a crime that shocked our community, shocked the nation, quite frankly. Days later, with the assistance of the community, and what we're seeing in Baltimore in 2016 is a community that's coming forward unlike it has in the past, and it's the community sharing with us information in an unprecedented way. So the community stepped forward, and only because of the community stepping forward and coupled with some great detective work, we identified that shooter as Carl Cooper. An extensive search was conducted in the Baltimore area for Mr. Cooper, and leads of his whereabouts quickly took us to North Carolina. Carl Cooper surrendered to law enforcement on March the 4th, 2016 in Fayetteville, North Carolina during Operation VR12. This incident occurred when Cooper missed his intended target, a rival drug dealer, and instead shot a 90-year-old woman and her little brother, an 82-year-old man. Thankfully, they were both wounded non-fatally. I visited both of them in the hospital, and at that age, when you're shot anywhere on your body, the risk of death is great. And we're very, very thankful that they both survived those two shootings and remain in remarkably great spirits. The suspect, Cooper, has a prior history for arrest of attempted murder and assault, as well as drug and handgun violations. He's what we would describe as a poster child for a violent repeat offender. Shortly after being developed as a suspect, we dubbed him Public Enemy #1 in Baltimore. Now, we've done Public Enemy #1 in Baltimore 8 times, and we're still batting 1,000. So when we put that Public Enemy #1 jersey on someone who's wanted for a crime, a violent crime that shocks the community, each and every time, 8 out of 8 times, we've been able to capture that person. This was the furthest the investigation took us away from Baltimore, but thanks to our U.S. Marshals Service, we captured him in North Carolina. So we're certainly grateful to the Marshals Service, the detectives of the Multi-Agency Warrant Apprehension Task Force, the officers and detectives from the BPD, and the citizens of Baltimore who again gave us countless tips. We told folks in Baltimore that 2016 was going to be a different year. So when we know you're wanted for a crime, we're going to talk about you. If we have video, we're going to put video out about you. We're going to put your picture out, and we're going to plaster your name throughout our community until we bring you into custody. And Mr. Cooper's arrest is an example of that. And I want to end by just giving a personal note of thanks to a long-time friend of mine, and I'm sure many others in this room, Maryland's Marshal Johnny Hughes, who I still believe is the longest-serving U.S. Marshal in the country. At least Johnny tells me that every time I talk to him. But he's remarkable. The mold was broken when Johnny Hughes arrived on planet Earth, and there is no better partner to the BPD or local law enforcement throughout the state of Maryland than Johnny Hughes and the men and women who work for him. So I'm just very, very grateful and very excited about where this partnership is going to take public safety in the rest of this year and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner, and with that, we'll try to take your questions.
I can appreciate the desire to sort of pick up the sort of so-called worst of the worst, but one of the criticisms of operations like this is that there are however many other thousands of individuals who are scofflaws or criminals, or how about standing warrants, who sort of remain beneath the radar of the Marshals Service. So I was wondering if you could respond to that criticism about how many others remain out on the streets and are able to sort of flaunt their absence from the Marshals Service.
Well, I'll be glad to take it, and then certainly happy to turn it over to Director Harlow. Look, we would love to have greater resources to be able to do this kind of operation all the time, and then to be able to really have focused efforts in every city across the country. But we're dealing with the realities of our funding and of our manpower. And so from our perspective, the most responsible thing that we can do is to try to focus our resources, our limited federal resources, on those folks who are most responsible for violent crime across our country. That doesn't mean that other defendants that are out there that have local warrants shouldn't be arrested. We really look primarily to our local jurisdictions to execute on their own warrants. But that's where the federal law enforcement component here can work in partnership with our state and local counterparts to try to get those particularly dangerous people off the street.
I certainly couldn't have said it better, ma'am, but also I just want to point out that everything we do, we try to prioritize our work. But if you notice in one of my comments that we arrested another 5,500 people during this operation that didn't meet this criteria. So the work goes on every day, no matter what's happening out there. Our law enforcement partners are arresting people. These operations are just trying to get bang for our buck, produce impact.
You know, there's a lot of focus right now on reducing sentences for nonviolent offenders. When you see thousands of people on the street with multiple previous convictions, does it give you any pause in the effort to reduce previous sentences? Or do you think there's sort of a flip side where maybe some of these people should not have been back out on the street?
Actually, for those of you all who may have been with us a couple of days ago when I was talking about Smart on Crime, this effort that we have here is entirely consistent with what we're trying to accomplish with Smart on Crime. We're trying to focus our limited federal resources on those cases that will have the greatest impact on our communities. And that means those repeat offenders and violent offenders who are the relative handful that are causing the violence in our communities. It's important that we be allocating our resources in that way and not necessarily doing a dragnet and getting everybody out there who has any drug conviction who's a low-level nonviolent offender and putting them in federal prison, because that's taking really important resources that we need for those defendants who are really having a significantly negative impact on the safety of our communities. That doesn't mean these folks shouldn't and aren't being prosecuted. It's just that that should happen on the local side rather than on the federal side.
You mentioned at the beginning the attack in Brussels. If I could ask you a question about that for a moment. I know the FBI has said that they stand ready to assist Belgium in the investigation. Could you tell us what specific assistance is being offered, and has Belgium accepted that assistance?
Well, I'm not in a position today to really give you an operational update, as I mentioned. I can tell you that both we and the FBI have been in contact with our counterparts there. We've offered anything and everything to law enforcement in Brussels, and certainly would look to them to be able to respond to you on exactly what's being done. We don't want to speak for them about how their investigation is being.
Deputy Attorney General, a non-operational question. For the last couple of years, we've heard about some issues with the sharing of information with European countries that are concerned about privacy and are concerns about the sharing of information of people who are foreign fighters, for instance, that are returning to European countries. When something like Belgium happens, I wonder if you look back and think we're satisfied about the way we're sharing that kind of information. We're getting the proper information to make sure people who are coming back there aren't getting on planes and coming here.
Well, we're never satisfied here. There are always ways that we can improve, and certainly information sharing is one of those arenas in which there is room for improvement, and we're working hard on that every day.
Deputy Attorney General, can you specify when the government learned that there could be a viable alternative way to get into the San Bernardino iPhone? I know in your pleadings you stated that it was demonstrated on Sunday, but can you give us more guidance on the timeline?
Yeah, and I'm not really in a position to go beyond what we've said in our pleadings. It was demonstrated to us on that Sunday, the day before, that we gave notice to the court in San Bernardino, and that's really, we're not in a position to go beyond that.
I agree that the fact that you guys had to make that last minute filing, the optics are not great for FBI and the Department of Justice. Your whole case was based on the premise that Apple had the exclusive technology to break into this phone, and that by making that last minute filing, you're essentially saying, well, that may be true or it may not be true.
Well, look, we've been working hard all along, both prior to filing this litigation and during the pendency of the litigation, to try to figure out any way possible to be able to execute the search warrant that we had obtained from the court. And so those efforts continued even after the litigation had begun. And in part because of the high profile of this litigation, companies from all over reached out to the FBI. And we were able to determine then, we were a little surprised, and I imagine some other folks were as well, that there may be, and that's an important caveat here, there may be another alternative. And we're trying to track that down now.
There's a report in Israeli media that an Israeli company has offered assistance to the FBI and the Justice Department in this matter. Can you comment on that, and can you give an update as to when you may know if that assistance will work?
And at the risk of sounding like a broken record here, I'm not going to go beyond what we have in our pleadings in terms of identifying who the third party might be. We are, I think we have said in our pleading, we'll give an updated status report on April 5th.
On the operation, you are for the worst violent offenders, I assume, because if you committed a murder, there's a chance you will commit more murders. Is there any correlation you guys have drawn? Perhaps Commissioner Davis can talk about this, or the impact you actually see in violence when you take a murderer off the street. Is there any downstream effects that you notice in neighborhoods or a reduction in crime?
Well, we go after a murderer not necessarily because he or she is going to commit another murder, but because they've already committed one. And that's, yeah.
You're trying to hold people to justice, but you're also trying to affect the crime rate, I assume.
Absolutely.
Is there any correlation to this at all? Is there any?
Well, certainly there's a correlation that repeat offenders are more likely, if you have someone who's committed an isolated offense against a history of a law-abiding history, they commit one isolated offense. I mean, common sense plus data will tell you that that's not the person who's most likely to be a real public safety problem in that district. But where you have somebody who offends over and over and over again, and particularly where there are violent offenses, that's somebody we need to get off the streets, and that's what we were trying to do with this initiative.
Since the Brussels attack, there's been some critics who have said that law enforcement should step up patrols of the Muslim community, and that the Muslim community is complicit in hiding bad people. How do you respond to those comments? Is there any credibility to those comments at all? Does there need to be stepped up patrols of the Muslim community?
I can tell you that the Muslim community is one of our greatest partners in our fight against terrorism and public safety generally. And so, no, we do not believe that we need to step up patrols of Muslim communities.
Yesterday, the Syrian Electronic Army was charged by the Justice Department, or at least several people associated with them. How concerned are you about foreign hackers going after the U.S. government?
We're concerned about any hackers going after the U.S. government, and that includes foreign hackers.
Commissioner, how is
Second from Clinton.
sorry, annoying. Commissioner, just speaking of Baltimore, how would you describe the city, the violence, especially compared to last year, which was obviously an especially difficult year for the city in the wake of the death of Freddie Gray? How are things going in Baltimore?
Well, you know, I was enjoying a press conference where I'm not on the spot. So, now, 2015 in Baltimore was an asterisk year. The violence shot straight through the roof post-unrest. So, you know, we had 344 murders in Baltimore, a city of 623,000 people in 2015. I don't believe for 1 second we have 344 murderers. We have violent repeat offenders who kill again and again. And to Del Wilbur's question earlier, the impact of getting them off the street as quickly as humanly possible with good, sound, probable cause is paramount in a city like Baltimore. What we're seeing that's very encouraging in Baltimore this year compared to last year is our homicide closure rate is double what it was this time last year. And that's thanks in no small part to the rehabilitation, and it's in progress, of the relationship between the police and the community. It's one of those moments in an American city where people, regardless of whether they wear a uniform or live in a row home, are saying enough is enough, and we're not going to subject ourselves to this level of violence. So what we are seeing is increased tips, people coming forward, sharing with us information that maybe they were reluctant to in the past. In Baltimore, like you know, there's a real culture of violence and witness retaliation in Baltimore. It's a very real thing. So we've done some bigger and better things to take precautions with our local prosecutor to afford people protections when they do raise their hand and say, hey, I want to give you information, or one step further, hey, I actually want to be a state's witness in a case. So 2015 has really given us an opportunity to improve all of those shortcomings.
Commissioner, while you're at it, can you give us an update as to the status of your negotiations with the Justice Department Civil Rights Division on fixing whatever police practices are unconstitutional or troublesome?
So as you know, that's an ongoing DOJ investigation. Thankfully, I had about 4.5 years with Prince George's County when we were in the midst of a consent decree there. Learned a lot during that relationship. I do think a DOJ experience can improve your crime fight and improve community relations. I don't think they're mutually exclusive endeavors. So DOJ will at some point in time, I can't speak for them, nor will I try to get myself in trouble. They'll at some time announce their findings, and then after they announce their findings, they'll announce their remedy. I will say that we're the first police department that I know of that stood up a full-time Department of Justice Compliance and Accountability team that interacts exclusively with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division regarding their requests for documents and policies and interviews, et cetera. So we welcome their presence on our police department. We think they'll only make us better.
All right, thanks, guys.